All right, today we're going to tackle the massive Wikipedia file on a truly pivotal modern leader. We're going to distill it all down to the absolute essentials: the life, the career, and the presidency of Barack Obama. We'll trace his journey from a pretty unlikely start all the way to his lasting legacy. First things first, his place in history really starts with this number. He was, of course, the 44th President of the United States, and he served 2 terms from 2009 all the way to 2017. But, that number, it only tells you part of the story. Because this is the truly historic part. His election was just a watershed moment in American history. I mean, it broke a racial barrier that had stood for more than 200 years. That fact alone completely reshaped the entire landscape of American politics. So, how do we make sense of such a consequential figure? Well, we're going to follow a pretty clear path. We'll start with his unlikely origins, then trace his meteoric rise to the presidency. After that, we'll look at how he governed a nation in crisis, explore his role as commander-in-chief, and finally, we'll try to weigh the legacy he leaves behind. So for our first section, we're covering his really unique personal history. You see, before he was a politician, he was a young man navigating a very complex identity, one that stretched all the way from the shores of Honolulu to the streets of Chicago. The just sheer global nature of his heritage is pretty remarkable when you think about it. He was born in Hawaii to a Kenyan father and a mother from the American heartland, Kansas. He spent some of his formative years in Indonesia and even had European roots through his grandparents. I mean, this is not the typical backstory of an American president. And, this quote from his memoir, Dreams from My Father, it gives us this really powerful glimpse into his own perception of that heritage as a young boy. It speaks to a kind of innocence that would later have to evolve into a much, much more complex understanding of race and identity in America. His academic path was just as remarkable. So after graduating from Columbia, he goes to Harvard Law School. And it was there that he first stepped onto the national stage. But not as a politician, but as the very first African-American president of the super prestigious Harvard Law Review. That achievement is actually what got him his first wave of national media attention. So before he ever even ran for office, his career was already grounded in service and the law. He worked as a community organizer on Chicago's South Side, he practiced as a civil rights attorney, and he taught constitutional law. And this foundation, you can see how it would deeply influence his political philosophy later on. Okay, so how does that guy become president? Let's get into his political career. His rise was, nothing short of meteoric, and it was launched by a single speech that completely captivated the nation and set him on this almost improbable path to the White House. This timeline here really shows that rapid ascent. He started in state politics in '97. But the pivot point, the moment everything changed, was that 2004 keynote speech at the Democratic National Convention. It was electrifying. It made him a household name, and just 4 years later, he was elected president. It happened that fast. And the scale of that 2008 victory was just immense. This was not a narrow win. With 365 electoral votes to John McCain's 173, he received a really clear mandate from the American people, winning states that hadn't voted for a Democrat in decades. Okay, on to Section 3, his time in office. He entered the presidency facing these monumental domestic challenges, from a collapsing economy to a totally fractured healthcare system, and his response to all of that would really define his first term. So, what do you do to tackle crises like that? Well, his presidency is really marked by 2 landmark pieces of legislation that were aimed at addressing the biggest issues facing the country head-on. And to really understand the pressure he was under, just look at this number. In October 2009, unemployment hit a staggering 10%. The Great Recession was in full swing, and the economy was just shedding hundreds of thousands of jobs every single month. The situation was absolutely dire. So his administration's response focused on these 2 big things. To fight the financial crisis, he signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, a massive economic stimulus package. And to reform healthcare, he passed the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, which protected people with pre-existing conditions and really just fundamentally changed the rules for insurance companies. But beyond those 2 cornerstones, his domestic agenda was pretty broad. He appointed the first Hispanic Supreme Court Justice, Sonia Sotomayor. He signed equal pay legislation. He repealed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that banned gay and lesbian people from serving openly in the military. And he eventually became the first sitting president to endorse same-sex marriage. Let's shift gears now to his role as commander-in-chief. Because on the world stage, his presidency was this real blend of winding down inherited wars, making some historic diplomatic openings, and ordering very decisive military actions. And this timeline highlights some of those defining moments. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize very, very early in his presidency. He formally ended the combat mission in Iraq, but he also authorized the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Then, in his second term, he pursued these major diplomatic shifts, normalizing relations with Cuba and negotiating the Iran nuclear deal. His approaches to the two wars he inherited really stood in contrast with each other. In Iraq, the strategy was a full withdrawal of combat troops, which he completed. But in Afghanistan, he first authorized a troop surge to try and stabilize the country before beginning a gradual drawdown. It was a very different strategic calculation. And all of this sort of coalesced into what analysts started calling the Obama Doctrine. It was basically a shift away from these large-scale ground wars towards a model that relied more on surgical strikes, on special forces, and on empowering local partners to fight their own battles, a lead-from-behind approach, as some people called it. Finally, let's turn to his legacy. So how is his presidency viewed now, and what's its lasting impact going to be? I mean, he left office as a historically significant president, but the debate over his legacy, well, that's still going on. His approval ratings tell a part of that story. He entered office with a really high 68% approval rating, and despite a pretty tumultuous 8 years, he left with a strong 59% approval. And let me tell you, it is rare for a two-term president to leave office that popular. So, what are the defining takeaways of his time in office? The list is pretty significant. Obviously, his historic election. Then there's the Affordable Care Act, averting a much deeper economic depression, the raid that killed bin Laden, and major international agreements on climate and relations with Cuba. These are really the pillars of his presidency. And that leaves us with this final question. He's already ranked highly by historians. But when you look at that list, was it breaking a barrier? Was it passing a law? Or was it a single command that will ultimately be seen as his most defining contribution? Well, that's the question that future generations are going to continue to answer.